Yeah, I just got them.
Okay. So hello everyone. We are starting the new year of new academic year with the first Majlis of the year, and I'm very happy to see you, so many of you. I see a lot of names whom I know and who are regular visitors and regular participants of our community. And I also see people who are not. So for this reason, I very shortly mention how the Majlis's work. We have a distinguished guest at each Majlis, and what is unusual about these events that the first part of they consist of 3 parts, and the first part is dedicated to our guests' own journey. They will tell about themselves and their research, but also their lives and how life formed them, the good and the bad experiences, which are always, I find them always immensely educative. And then when you hear the travel of someone like Shawkat, I bet we will learn a lot. So that, and then our guest turns to the research topic of the day, which is advertised, and it will be great fun today. And then when that talk part of the Majlis is over, I stop the recording and the floor is open for questions and discussions. I always regret stopping the recording because the discussions are immensely stimulating, but on the other hand, I want to keep them completely free. I want everyone there to ask what you want to ask, so this is the reason for it. Now, this start of the term is fairly special in the sense that it's very busy. The Center for the Study of Islam is very busy in the first 2 weeks, and because well, after Shawkat's Majlis today, we will have another event on Wednesday at 4 o'clock UK time, which is a visiting speaker lecture, and it's Vinay Khetia, Contested Memories, the Construction of the Image of Fatima in Sunni and Shii Historiography and Hadith. So on Fatima, in view Shii and Sunni interpretations on Fatima, and of course the gender application, how it affects views on gender and so on. So now, this was a week ago, this was a normal visiting speaker lecture, and then we made it recently hybrid, and then we found out this afternoon that there won't be trains, and he's in London, so it will be online. I put the link for this one and the 2 others I will announce into the chat. So please register there, but we have already advertised it, and we will advertise it again. And then on Monday, we will have the next Majlis, which will be Parvane Pur Shariati, Sharing Wives and Drinking Wine, the Mazdakids, the Ayars, the Mitraist Accusations and Realities. Well, the title shows it will be quite interesting as well. And then we will have again a visiting speaker, hopefully in person, Hafsa, and but that we always meant it to be broadcasted, so you will be able to join us also online on the Zoom link, and it will be it's a contemporary topic: colonizing Kashmir, state building under Iranian occupation. So please come to all of them if you can. And then after this very intensive 2 weeks, we will be back to the normal one Majlis per week pattern. Now, I was really thinking how to introduce Shawkat, and let us say I don't have the poetic quality to properly describe him, even poorly. So I won't really try. And many of you know him anyway, and also, well, the best way to know him is to let him speak. So I won't say much. I just want to thank him for being a kind of incarnation of unassuming greatness, and his genuine generosity, kindness, and friendship, what he is, and for his incredible sense of humor. What I didn't know about him is his heroism, and I would like you all to appreciate it, because he landed 13 hours ago from a very long trip from Abu Dhabi through London, and then he is with us now. So I'm very grateful for not canceling this. Thank you, Shawkat. I put myself on mute.
Thanks very much. I think it's customary to thank the person introducing for an overly generous introduction. I think this is the most overly generous I've had. I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful for your friendship. Thank you all for coming. I'm happy I'm able to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. It would have been delightful to be at Exeter, a place I visited once and I very much like, and where several people who I feel I'm close to work. The scholarly journey, I have to put my timer on because I can really go on about this, but I was born in England to parents from the island of Mauritius. They met in England. So my journey started there. We moved to Paris, so I did much of my early schooling in Paris. I grew up in a household speaking French, and I was sent to an English school and came home crying. I went to a French maternelle and then went to the English school of Paris. Came home crying because I was the only kid who didn't know English in the school, so my parents switched to English. Being from Mauritius, they already spoke several languages. Grew up with that, and then my father was transferred to Japan, and then to Hong Kong, and then to Singapore. And so I spent most of my life in Paris and Singapore. And in Singapore, I went to an international school. And when the time came to apply to university, I said to my mother, I'm thinking about studying law in England. And she said, why would you want to make a living lying to people, thereby killing my first dream? It wasn't really a dream, it was just an aspiration. I thought, what should I do? I don't know what I'm going to do. Thought about it more, and I thought, well, the thing that really I'm really passionate about, as opposed to thinking about a vocation, is literature. And so I thought I'd study literature. But also the conversation with my mother and with others led me to realize that I didn't want to decide quite yet. And so I heard that in the United States, you don't have to decide right away. And so although the bulk of the people in my school applied to England and applied for a course, I was one of the very few, in fact, only 2 that year, who applied to the US. The other person was an American. I decided I would pick some languages and go to a university that taught 1, 2 or more of those 3 languages. I should say one was a language group. So I picked Arabic because it was a language in a family I didn't know, and we read the Quran. I grew up reading the Quran, not understanding it, as with so many young Muslims. I also picked Gujarati, which was our ancestral language, which my parents never spoke to me. And then I thought I would study an American language because I'd be going to America. So I thought, and any language in the Native American indigenous language family. And that's how I decided to pick universities. And I'll spare you the process, but I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, where I signed up for, or I planned to sign up for, Arabic, Gujarati, and Hopi. But when I arrived, Hopi was not being offered that year. And although I took 6 weeks of Gujarati with the great George Cardona, great Sanskritist, Roger Allen, who's probably known to many of you, took me aside and said, why are you wasting your time learning your ancestral language? You can learn that anytime. Learn Arabic. More people need to learn Arabic. And don't take Arabic 5 hours a week. Take Arabic 10 hours a week. And so I took intensive Arabic and was hooked. So I studied Arabic. And 3-4 weeks later, I walked up to him he was riding his bicycle into work as he always did. And I said, Dr. Allen, which is what we called him, Dr. Allen, how does someone become like you? And he said, what do you mean? I said, how do you end up doing what you do? And he said, well, you do a degree in Arabic, then you do a PhD in Arabic, then you find a job at a university. And I said, great, that's what I'm going to do. And he said, well, it's a little bit early. And I said, I need something to guide me. That seems like a reasonable thing to guide me. Doesn't mean I'll stick with it. Of course I did, but the journey was not a straightforward one. I did indeed major in well, it wasn't really called Arabic, it was called Oriental Studies, but I specialized in Arabic, and I stayed on and did a master's. My master's thesis was on Adonis, on one of his poetry collections, which actually subsequently appeared, A Time Between Ashes and Roses, which I published with Syracuse University Press. Around 1986, I said to him, I've been in school continuously since I was 4, and I'm beginning to feel it. And he said, well, just take a break, go apply for a fellowship somewhere, go and don't do anything. Just relax. So that's what I did. And I was able to get a fellowship to the American Research Center in Egypt. And I went there. My project was to study the poets who had been influenced by Adonis in the next generation, which seemed like a natural subject to pursue because of my thesis. And I had a wonderful time in Cairo. I read a lot of African literature, read more Arabic literature. In fact, 2 of my earliest articles arise out of things that I did there, or that I fine-tuned there, an article on Mahfouz, an article on Tayyib Saleh. So I was pretty much in the modern, but one of my mentors had been George Makdisi, and I still had very much a foot in medieval studies and in the medieval. I submitted my proposal to my department for a doctoral dissertation on the poetry collection that I had translated and studied on Adonis. And so I remained at the same university, at the University of Pennsylvania. And the reaction was not one that I was happy with. It wasn't rejected, but I was being asked to think more about the political context, think more about the circumstances around which the collection was written, and also expand it to a consideration of other collections by Adonis. And this annoyed me. And I explained to Roger Allen that had I been working on T.S. Eliot and 4 quartets, for example, I wouldn't have been told to do all of that. It would have appeared legitimate to an English department that I wanted to focus on a particular collection. So my response was not to throw a hissy fit or anything, but it was to call George Makdisi on the phone and say, can I see you when I get back from my fellowship? And I went to see him, and I said, I'm abandoning the modern. I want to go back to the medieval. And he said, okay, if that's what you want, it's your dissertation. It's not our dissertation. What do you want to work on? And I said, well, I don't know. Can you guide me? And he said, well, I'm not going to tell you what to work on. You need to decide. So I said, well, how am I going to decide? And he said, well, do you own Setzgin? And I said, no, I don't. I always use the Geschichte des Arabischen Schriftums. I said, I use the one in the library. He goes, great. Volume 1 and Volume 2. Go read them, cover to cover. Come back to me with 4 names. So I did what I was asked, and I went. I should add, on my way to starting a job at Duke University, a full-time job at Duke University. And so there was, I'm not sure I was anxious, but I was certainly keen on getting something resolved. So I read Setzgin, and I came up with 4 names. Sadly, I can only remember 3 of them today. But one was Yahya ibn Ma'in, the hadith scholar. One was Al-Madaini, the antiquarian. There's another one, and I just don't remember which. I'll have to reread Setzgin 1 and 2 to try and work out who it was. And the 4th was Ibn Abi Tahir, Tayfur, who many people call Ibn Tayfur. And he said, well, look, Yahya ibn Ma'in is being worked on by someone in Germany. Al-Madaini is a great antiquarian, but there's not a lot of stuff you can work on. I don't remember what he said about the 3rd person because I don't remember the 3rd person. And the 4th one, he said, why Ibn Abi Tahir? And I said, well, one of his surviving works, actually it's 1 volume from his surviving works, is called Balaghat al-Nisa, and that's interesting to me that someone will be interested in such a topic. The Kitab Baghdad, 1 volume survives. It's actually the volume that talks about the period of al-Ma'mun. And he said, yeah, he's interesting. And then he said, you know, Ibn Durayd once said, when he was asked, when he was in a gathering and people were discussing the wonderful things in the world, and they were just naming places, right? They were naming the fire temple of Balkh and the Bawan Gorge in Fars and so on, Ghuta Oasis. He said, you know, oh, those are fine, but what about the things that are the delights of the mind? And he named 4 books in one riwayah. He named 4 books because there's another riwayah where different books are named. He says, in one riwayah, he says the Bayan wa Tabyin of Jahiz, the Uyun al-Akhbar of Ibn Qutayba, the Amali of al-Qali, and the Qalaq al-Mushtaq of Ibn Abi Tahir. Why don't you go and work out why Ibn Abi Tahir is one of the 4 that he named? Because we all know that al-Jahiz, Ibn Qutayba, and al-Amali are important. And I said, great idea, thank you. Marching orders. And so I decided to look into Ibn Abi Tahir, and that's what I did. Although I did start this job at Duke, I remember I gave a faculty presentation, and Bruce Lawrence said, if your dissertation were a baseball game, I think we are still in the first innings. And I said, that is an accurate representation of where I am in my career, because I switched dissertation topics. And it was my first job, and it was wonderful. And I had this kind of idea that I would be there forever, as it were, or the way things look when one gets one's first job and one hasn't finished one's dissertation yet. And I was the first person in my cohort to actually get a full-time job, which was, you know, for which I was grateful. In fact, I had went to Maqdisi before accepting it and said, you know, I have to write this new dissertation or this new topic, but I've been offered a job. You know, what should I do? And he just looked straight at me and he said, a job is a job is a job. And so I went to Duke, and I had a great time there. A couple of years was all I was there, because toward the end of the beginning, of the second year, my father contacted me. He was then, I had grown up in Singapore with him. My parents had moved to Malaysia. He'd become a diplomat. And he felt there was a conflict of interest for him to run the company, the family company, and be a diplomat, even though neither of the governments thought it was a conflict, and asked me whether I would come back. And as an only child, it was the one person he could ask. And so I resigned from Duke and moved to Malaysia to help my father with the family business, which is not something I ever thought I'd be doing. I had no hesitation. When Roger Allen said to me, this could negatively affect your career, I said to him, you know, I've always followed your advice in all matters relating to things academic. This is a family matter, and this is between me and my father, and this is the right thing to do. I have no hesitation. So I went off to Malaysia, couldn't really work on the dissertation, got married to a Mauritian, as it happens. So we're from the island of Mauritius. And then a year later, arranged to go back to the States to finish the dissertation. So I said, you know, I'm going to go away for a year, finish up, and then I'll come back. My father was perfectly fine with that. We'd set up systems. We'd hired someone to help run the company. I came back to the States. I'm now married with my wife, and 60% of the way through that year, my father shows up with my uncle and says, your mother's not well, which she wasn't. And so we're moving back to Mauritius, and I could use the help. And so once again, I packed up, again, no hesitation. My wife and I moved to Mauritius, and I lived there, worked in another family company there. So the company in Kuala Lumpur was called Indian Ocean Traders Sendirian Berhad, Indian Ocean Traders Private Limited. And the company in Mauritius was called Toorawa Exports Limited. So I did things like, in Malaysia, I would export tires, car tires and truck tires, furniture, aluminum extrusions, sweaters, not sweaters, but never mind, winter wear to Mauritius. When I was in Mauritius, I was exporting smoked marlin, ladies' underwear, anthuriums. It was quite interesting to be a minor Indian Ocean trader. I applied for a job at the University of Mauritius, and I didn't get it. And then I was contacted by the U.S. Embassy, and they said, we heard that you're doing a PhD in the United States. And I said, yes. And they said, well, why don't you present at a conference we're holding? The embassy and the university are holding a conference on the 200th anniversary of U.S.-Mauritius relations. So Mauritius, which was French at the time, as it happens, is one of the first places with which the U.S. had diplomatic relations because of the China trade. So ships would come from China to Mauritius, and there would be transshipments, and then the ships were being sent from Salem and from Philadelphia, and would come and take goods and take them to the United States. So the new United States. So I said, well, I don't have anything to present about. I don't work on the United States and I don't work on Mauritius. And the scholar that invited to help run this conference, Larry Bowman, said, who teaches the University of Connecticut, said to me, sat with me and said, look, can you find something? It would be really nice if we had you on this just because of the connection, because you are in fact a Mauritian who's not from Mauritius but is and was in the US and now you're here and so on. And I said, fine, I'll work something out. So I sat at my library and I started leafing through various books, and then I found one, and I'll talk about that book or that journal when I get to my talk, but that's just something to retain, the thing that I picked up. Anyway, I did that. I presented at this conference, which we'll hear about. That is how my interest in sort of Indian Ocean studies and pre-modern Indian Ocean began. At the very same conference, I met a professor from the University of Mauritius who said, I don't understand, why haven't you applied to the university for a job? And I said, I have, but I didn't get it. And he said, well, that's ridiculous, apply again. And I applied again. And this time, evidently, he managed to get the university to pay attention to my application. And I was hired. And I taught at the University of Mauritius for a few years. And then in 1999, in 1998, I was contacted by, I'm not sure I have my dates right, but I think so, by Skip Gates and Anthony Appia, whom I'd known at Duke. And they said, we have this fellowship at Harvard, why don't you apply for it? It's for scholars based at African universities. And I said, well, I'm not convinced Mauritius is in Africa now that I'm living here, other than geographically. And they said, what a great topic to apply to work on when you come here. So I did. And I applied for a fellowship at the Du Bois Institute at Harvard, and for a project called Is Mauritius in Africa? Is Africa in Mauritius? Race and Identity on an Indian Ocean Island. And I went and worked on that. And while I was there, my father, in the meantime, I'm married, right? I've lived in Malaysia. I've lived in Malaysia with my wife. I've lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania with my wife. We've come back to Mauritius. 2 children have been born. Now we're in Massachusetts. My father gives me a call and says, you moved to Malaysia, you moved to Mauritius. There's not much you can do for your mother. Her health continues to decline. My advice to you is apply for jobs. And if there are good ones, take them. And if they're not good, don't just give up Mauritius, a good job at the University of Mauritius, for something that's not very worthwhile or high caliber. So I applied. That was 1998, 99. And I got 2. And so I was trying to decide between the 2, and the 2 were Ohio State and Cornell, and I picked Cornell. And so we moved from Somerville, Mass to Cornell, which is how then I suppose I'd call it my subsequent US career started. I was 37 at that point, married, 2 children. Had I finished my dissertation? Yes, because I was able to complete my work while I was in the US and subsequently defend. But one of the things that I did, one of the things that I did when I was in Massachusetts is continue work I'd begun in Mauritius on Waqwaq. And what I did is I realized that the Encyclopedia of Islam was on the letter, must have been on the letter W, because I'd written an article on Sikbaj for S, and I'd written an article on Tahir al-Muhannad, the poet, and Tahir Saifuddin, the Da'i al-Mutlaq of the Boras, and on Ubaidullah ibn Abi Tahir, the son of Ibn Abi Tahir Tayfur, on whom my dissertation was. And I figured we must be on W. So I wrote to Wolfhard Heinrichs and Perry Bierman, who were at Harvard. And I said, do you have copies of the Waqwaq entry that I can read? Because I'm working on a piece on Waqwaq and I'd like it to be informed. And when they sent it to me, I read it. It was very long. And I picked up the phone and I called Perry Bierman and I said, you cannot go to press. This is outdated, misdirected, wrong. And I only know this because I've been working on it. And she said, okay, well, fix it. You have 3 days. Because what they had sent me was proofs. And so my kind of immersion into it was that way. And I invested a lot of what I had learned and studied into that article and set it aside. Once I was done with that, I said, okay, great. I've done everything I need to do. It's all in the Encyclopedia of Islam article, which is a perfectly acceptable place for it all to be. Although I did write a few other things, but I felt very comfortable with that. So when I went off to Cornell, dissertation completed, working on my first monograph, my only monograph. I resolved to write only one. I believe in the tyranny of the monograph in the academic system. Did many other things. One of those things was Waqwaq for a few years because people kind of had heard that I'd worked on it and asked me to give talks like this one on it. And then set it aside in maybe 2005. Got tenure at Cornell. Developed new directions in my work. Started to work on the Quran. So been heavily involved in Quranic studies. Started to work on a character called Azad Bilgrami, and actually spent a year in India, 0607, on a Mellon New Foundations Fellowship there, working on that. Didn't give a thought to Waqwaq. In 2016, moved to Yale. In 2019, Debbie Tor at Notre Dame said to me, I'd like to invite you for a series on Islamic studies. I'm trying to get people to explode the idea of Islamic studies for students and have them think about the discipline much more capaciously. And I said, well, the only thing I've ever done that is kind of Islamic studies, in inverted commas, but not, is Waqwaq. And she goes, perfect, come and talk about Waqwaq. So I did that, and I went there and presented. And then Petrus Cyprusland at Leiden said, I'd like you to give the Leiden Arabic lecture, do you have any topics in mind? And I said, well, no, I think she might have said, no, I said Quran. I just gave a talk on Waqwaq. I've just given a talk on the Quran. I've just given a talk about something else. And she goes, oh, Waqwaq, perfect. Come and talk about that. So I spoke about that. But the talk was delayed because of COVID, and I just went last year. And so my interest in Waqwaq was revived that way. Not something I expected, because I've spent the last 15 years still kind of, doing little things here and there in Abbasid Studies, which is sort of the one way of thinking about what I do. Doing a decent amount of work in Quranic studies. I have a book of translations, selected translations, coming out next year. And that's one way of telling my story via Waqwaq, I guess. I know I've spoken with Ismail earlier, and I think one of the questions that especially young scholars worry about, or one of the issues they worry about, is productivity and sort of doing what is expected. And the thing I say to my students is, you need to do what you love, otherwise you'll tire of it, or you'll become you'll develop antipathy towards what you're working on. And always do what you want to do. Just always do it well. Always do it. Do your research well. Present well. It has to have value for you, and if it has value for you, then it will have value for others. And it's what I've done. I think it's relatively clear to me that my path was quite circuitous, right? So I started my PhD in 1985, technically, and I defended it in 1998. And in that time, I lived in several other countries and was doing several other jobs. At one point, someone said to me, do you feel like all this is deflection is kind of a sign from the universe that you should stop working on the dissertation? And I said, only if my dissertation combusts and explodes will I think that there is a sign from God. I said to myself, I will finish it, and I'm going to. I didn't say to myself, I will be an academic employed at a university or tenured at a university. It was what I'd set as a kind of endpoint, but it was for the PhD. And so I was very happy when I'd finished my doctorate. And when I was working in the family companies, my father at one point said to me, I'm sorry that life has done this to you. I mean, he said it to me many years after I'd left Mauritius. And I said, and I remember specifically, I said to him, I said, first of all, you need to apologize for nothing. But second of all these things that I learned, all these things that I've worked on would never have happened if I'd not gone to Mauritius. And Waqwaq is notably one of them. It would never have occurred to me to work on this. So I'm grateful, for my life. And I'm also grateful for the circuitous journey. And here we are. I think it's 21 minutes according to my timer, so I should keep quiet now or move to another thing, unless it's fine. You want me to go on droning about my life. 22 minutes. Shall I start with Waqwaq?
Well, I'm happy to go wherever you go.
Why don't I do that? If people have questions about the other thing, I'm happy to talk about it. This way we'll have both parts of my presentation.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So you can all see the screen, I hope. What, where, and whither Waqwaq. Right. So for today's Majlis, my topic is evidently Waqwaq, a word and name of uncertain origin used by writers of medieval Arabic and Islamic travel and geographical literature to refer variously to a tree producing women fruit, as you can see here on the slide, to a race of people, to a bird, to an island, or to a group of islands. Why is my PowerPoint not working? There we go. To a group of islands. A region also sometimes said to be inhabited by a dark-skinned population who speak a distinctive language. One of the things that is wondrous about Waqwaq is that it persists and perdures to the present day as an integral part of Arabic culture and remains a topic of abiding interest to scholars of Arabic. Waqwaq is like Atlantis or El Dorado or the Fountain of Youth in its elusiveness, and in the fact that in the cultures where those concepts circulate, almost everyone recognizes those words. But Waqwaq is completely different in that it has a powerful hold on the Arabic imaginary, in that it is a motif to which authors and artists and creators have recourse, and in that it is the object of serious study by scholars. This on the left is a volume of published conference proceedings from 2007, L'arbre anthropogène du Waqwaq, les femmes, fruits et les îles des femmes, right? The anthropogenic tree from Waqwaq, of Waqwaq, from, women fruit and islands of women. And the thing on the right, with many of the different ways of saying Waqwaq, I'm just going to say Waqwaq. People say Waqalwaq and Waqwaq and so on, is from the Encyclopedia of Islam. And full disclosure, in fact, I've already disclosed, I am a co-author of this entry, which at over 6,000 words is twice as long as the entry devoted to Umar ibn al-Khattab. Further evidence of scholarly fascination, or maybe even misdirection. For well over a century, Arabic and Indian Ocean philologists have posited that Waqwaq is one place or another, one life form or another, one real or fabulous thing or another. This need arises out of a notion implicit in the colonial and philological enterprise that to be able to name something, to know how it got its name, and to put it on one's map is the better to be able to control it. And I must confess that I myself have not been immune to this need to identify, categorize, locate, and map Waqwaq. This is one of the other pieces that I wrote, and this was an attempt to locate it in the Indian Ocean, or to query whether it was in the Indian Ocean. But I hope I have been less constrained by what one might call the tyranny of identification. Indeed, Waqwaq can benefit and has benefited from a reciting and a rerouting and a rereading of island and tree, a perspective from the island, as it were, rather than the continent. Indeed, my own interest in Waqwaq began on an Indian Ocean island. So these are the French names. Mauritius is l'île Maurice in French. Mauritius is one of the Mascarenes, or les îles Mascarenes. There in 1996, I not only reread what Arabic sources on the Indian Ocean I could lay my hands on, complementing philology and trading continental colonial geographies and cartographies. After all, I was trained in the United States for Indian oceanic possibilities and potentialities. But I also finally got around to reading the spring 1987 issue of the Wilson Quarterly, a publication of the distinguished Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. A journal issue devoted to the bicentennial of the US Constitution, right, the 1987 issue, which I had purchased when it came out in D.C. almost 10 years earlier, but which I had never cracked open. In an article in that issue on the early United States, leading American historian Peter Onuf writes, quote, many foreign visitors remarked on the nation's general good fortune, nor have the rich the power of oppressing the less rich, said Thomas Cooper, a British scientist, for poverty such as in Great Britain is almost unknown. The passage continues, in parentheses, such reports were not always reliable. One traveler wrote home about the amazing American Waqwaq tree, with fruit that grew in the shape of a young woman. This parenthetical and spectacular remark, placing the Waqwaq tree in the New World, took me completely by surprise. The Waqwaq tree in America? And learning about that while I was on the very shores of Waqwaq, as it were? I was even more surprised, and by the way, this is what formed the basis of my presentation at the conference. on the 200th anniversary, and it was about using this remark as a way of thinking about the relationship between the United States and the Indian Ocean and Mauritius. I was even more surprised to learn from the author of the article that he was not the author of the statement. And this is the facts that he sent me. I'm embarrassed to say that the reference to the American Waqwaq, sorry, this is actually covering my, was introduced by the editor without consulting me. I don't have the faintest idea where it came from. I wish I could help, particularly in view of the extraordinary effort you have made to contact me. I therefore decided to contact the journal editors directly. And when I inquired of them the origin of the interpolation, I received the following answer. I received your request for information concerning our reference to the American Waqwaq tree in a 1987 issue of the Wilson Quarterly. Unfortunately, we no longer have our files on that article. The only help I can offer is that the item came from some fairly common secondary source. A fairly common secondary source. I think it is fair to say that the beginning of my real fascination with Waqwaq has its origin in my desire to find this American source, and therefore this American Waqwaq tree. Now, it wasn't long before a bird appeared. Just as the name cuckoo is onomatopoeic in English and other European languages, so too is one of its names in Arabic, Waqwaq. This is the only instance of the word Waqwaq, or something similar to it, attaching itself to something real life, or rather positively identifiable. There is also a bird called waq, which is a bittern. It should be showing up. There it is. Of interest is the fact that the bittern closely resembles an extinct, some say legendary, bird. The prayer, excuse me. I moved to the living room. Sorry. Of interest is the fact that the bittern closely resembles an extinct, some say legendary bird, the Leguatia gigantea, or solitaire, first drawn and identified by François Legas in his account of the Mascarene island of Rodrigues. There it is, the solitaire. I think I might have, there's the cover of the book. Sorry, it's not a very good image. The historian North Coombs, and you can see Rodrigues there in one of the Mascarene Islands. The historian North Coombs believes that when the famous 15th century Indian Ocean navigator Ibn Majid mentions an island by the name Tiriraja, the island of Rodrigues is meant. He and G.R. Tibbets, the editor and translator of Ibn Majid's main work, both suppose the name to be from the Arabic for Ruh. The Ruh, or rock, is the giant bird of Arabic legend, mentioned among other places in the 1001 Nights, which we will be encountering again. There's one drawing of Ruh. Maybe there is an affinity between the Ruh and the solitaire. Certainly there is a resemblance. In many ways, this intersection of an actual bird, the bittern or the waq, with a fabulous one, the rook or the solitaire, is typical of the crisscrossing of Waqwaq in all its significations and elaborations, in this case a bird and an Indian Ocean island. Of the fauna of Waqwaq, Buzurg ibn Shahriyar reports in the 10th century Ajaib al-Hind that, quote, Muhammad ibn Babshad relates that in the region of Al-Waqwaq, there are scorpions the size of birds. When they sting a man, his body swells, he falls ill, his skin peels off, and he dies. There is also reportedly a bird in Waqwaq of red, white, green, and blue plumage, like a woodpecker, called samandal, that can live in fire and live without water. In his 10th century encyclopedia, the Mafatih al-Ulum, Al-Khwarizmi, after noting that Candiz, the most easterly town in the world, is situated, quote, at the extremity of China and Waqwaq, close quote, goes on to describe the world as a bird, with China as its head and Waqwaq beyond it. Descriptions of the world in the shape of a bird are common in Arabic Islamic literature. A century or so earlier, Ibn Abd al-Hakam had also described the world as a bird, observing that its right wing is Iraq, beyond which live a people called Waq, beyond them live a people called Waqwaq, and beyond them yet another people, anonymous, known only to God, and you can see it here where the arrow is, right? والجناح الأيمن العراق وخلف العراق أمة يقال لها واق وخلف واق أمة يقال لها وقواق وخلف ذلك من الأمم ما لا يعلمه إلا الله عز وجل, right? Here, the idea of a bird and the idea of a people or race of Waq are evoked. Note that this Waq or Waqwaq is connected to Iraq, but not, as in the later account, to China. More fusions were to follow in the 9th, 10th, and later centuries, especially in works in the Ajaib genre, works which describe the marvels or wonders of the world. In his 12th century Persian account, Tabai Hayavan, Marvazi writes, I have read in the Kitab al-Bahr that in the island of Waqwaq, where ebony grows, there is a tribe whose nature is like that of men in all their limbs, except the hands, instead of which they have something like wings, which are webbed like the wings of a bat, what. They both, male and females, eat and drink while kneeling. They follow the ships asking for food. When a man makes for them, they open these wings and their flight becomes like that of birds, and no one can overtake them. This account is noteworthy for its use of watwat, bat, a word very close in sound and form to waqwaq, and for its conflation of birds and humans. This happens in popular literature too, where the island of Waqwaq makes an appearance. In the 1001 Night story of Hassan of Basra and the Bird Maiden, Hassan's wife has left her conjugal home, taking their 2 sons with her, and literally flown back to Waqwaq. The Bird Maiden is now a card, this is on the left, a card in the game Magic, the Gathering, or MTG, a tabletop and digital card game which between 2008 and 2016 produced 20 billion cards, not of this card, but 20 billion actual cards. So this is something called the extension. This is a whole Arabian Nights extension, and there she is, the Bird Maiden. There is a similar pursuit of a spouse in the 14th century romance of Saif bin the Yazan, when King Saif is urged by his wrong and distraught wife to pursue her and her son. I think I have this quote, yes. You seized me first, then afflicted me with grief and deserted me to take other women. But what has been, has been. If you have any valor and resolve, and if you truly love me, then pursue me to the city of maidens in the islands of Waqwaq. With that, she clasped her son beneath her garment at her breast and vanished through the air. In these last 2 accounts, Waqwaq is the name given to islands evidently inhabited by bird-like women. It is not made clear where these islands might be, but the accounts certainly all agree with a displacement somewhere distant. But the unusual women are new, or are they? There are, in fact, early accounts that identify a tree with fruits having a human appearance and that connect women to trees in other ways. The tree with human fruit first appears in Arabic in Al-Mutahhar al-Maqdisi's 10th century history, Kitab al-Badw al-Tariq, the book of creation and history, where the author states that the tree is called Waqwaq and grows in India. I should mention, I don't remember if I write about this, I don't think I do. Jahiz is actually the first mention of the branch of the tree of a kind of interspecies tree, but he doesn't mention the women. The presence of the tree in India is enshrined on the cover of Richard Lanoy's celebrated study of Indian society titled The Speaking Tree, and pays homage to Mughal representations of Waqwaq-like trees. So I could not find a good image of the book, but this is on the right is the image that it includes, and this is a Mughal interpretation here. A wondrous tree, or a Mughal image, a wondrous tree described by Buzurg ibn Shahriyar in the Wonders of India, or the Indies, the Ajaib al-Hind, has foliage and fruit in the shape of human faces, but is not called Waqwaq, though it comes from Waqwaq. And this is another thing that happens, is you have the tree called Waqwaq, then the islands, then there's a conflation of the two, or a combination of the two. Knowledge of this tree appears to have spread quite far and from very early on. It was apparently mentioned in the Lost Tung Tien, or Comprehensive Institutions, a Chinese institutional history and encyclopedia from the 8th century, that quotes the Jingqinji, or Record of Travels, my Chinese pronunciation is terrible and I apologize, of his nephew, of Tung Tian's nephew, Du Huan, and which is quoted in later encyclopedias. From it, we learn that Du Huan was captured and taken to Iraq around 750, where he heard stories of the wondrous tree from Arab sailors. This is the account in Chavan's translation, and that's the Chinese proof text, but I cannot read it. That note is by Victor Mayer, a professor of Chinese at University of Pennsylvania. The king of the Tashe, Arabs, it's the word Tajik, actually, had dispatched men who aboard a ship and carrying with them clothes and provisions, went to sea. They proceeded by sea for 8 years without reaching the far western shore. In the middle of the sea, they saw a square rock. On this rock was a tree with red branches and green leaves. On the tree, a large number of small children had grown. They were 6 or 7 thumbs length. When they saw people, they did not speak, but they could all laugh and move. Their hands, feet, and heads were attached to the branches of the trees. When men detached them and held them, as soon as they were in their hands, they dried up and became black. The travelers returned with the branch of this tree, which is now housed in the palace of the Tashi. The account of Tuhan, as it turns out, is very close to the account in Buzurg's Ajaib al-Hind, except that Tuhan's account has a crown of small children instead of fruit with human faces. The story is repeated in later accounts. For example, the little human fruits are said to utter the cry waqwaq when they land on the ground. In one Persian tale, the fruits of a tree ripen, fall to the ground, mature into men's heads, and then one of the fruits greets the king respectfully. A version of this story makes its way to 12th century Spain and appears in substantially the same form in one version of a work by the European traveler Friar Odoric. The oldest surviving description of the waqwaq tree in Arabic, which numerous authors state categorically is not the origin of the name of the eponymous islands, is the Ajaib al-Hind. But most accounts report essentially the same thing. In his 12th century philosophical allegorical tale, Hayy ibn Yaqzan, Ibn Tufail describes an island below the equator where people are born without mother or father and where there is a tree which bears women as fruits. There you see it. Alternative accounts of the women fruit have the tree cry at sunrise and sunset, or grow with the dawning of the sun, die at sunset, and be born again the next morning with fruits that are lethal. Or be like the tree whose fruits are aphrodisiac, found on Tauran, an island ruled by a king surrounded by 4,000 women. From the 13th century Al-Qazwini, we learn of a certain Queen Damhara who rules over Waqwaq, naked and in sandals of gold and surrounded by 4,000 female slaves. The later description by the 15th century Ibn al-Wardi distinguishes itself by its attention to rather graphic detail. He writes, "On this island are trees that bear fruit like women, with shapes, bodies, eyes, hands, feet, hair, breasts, and vulvas like the vulvas of women. They are the most beautiful of face and hang by their hair. They come out of cases like big swords, and when they feel the wind and sun, they yell, waq waq, until their hair tears apart. When their hair, this is me now, when the hair tears, they die. In some accounts, the fruit is in the shape of a man or animal, but in most, in the shape of a woman, suspended by the hair. When the fruit is ripe, the woman fruit cries out waq waq, or in fact, praise God, the Khallaq. This ability only to cry out this one phrase and then die has been perceptively interpreted by the literary scholar Fedwa Malti Douglas as an example of the occultation of women's voice while her body is on display. It is also, for me, reminiscent of an account about the Prophet Muhammad's wife Aisha, who on her deathbed is reported to have wished she were a leaf or a tree uttering the praises of God. This is in Ibn Sa'ad. Ibn al-Wardi's account continues with details right out of the imagination of a male fantasy, articulating a male-conceived sexual cosmography. But there is more. Beyond these trees are women more beautiful and more shapely, with whom intercourse, permitted apparently only if one has witnessed the shearing of their hair, with whom intercourse is then literally heavenly, and which leads from sheer exhaustion to death. Indeed, whether the name of a wondrous creature, a tree, an island, a complex of islands, or even a country, Waqwaq always insists on that aspect of its referent, which is the corporal, ultimately leading to the sexual. One could, in fact, explore at length the oppositions: corporal, male-female, corporal sexual, heavenly terrestrial, and by an analogical extension, civilized, primitive, normative, monstrous, articulate, inarticulate, rational, / animal, vegetal, upright, erect, upside down, receptive, desiring, desirable, subject, subjecting, object, objectified, pure, transgressive, and so on. Now, one of the Christian myths circulating in the Middle Ages located a golden age of primitive goodness in the distant West. The classical fables of the Isles of the Blessed, or Hesperides, St. Brendan's Promised Lands of the Saints, with echoes for me of the Indian Ocean island of Saint-Brandon, which is so small it's not on this map, but that's where it is, and the terrestrial paradise in which Adam and Eve had lived, were located beyond the western horizon. And the association of women with trees has a long tradition in Christianity. The most obvious Christian connection is that of Eve with the tree of knowledge. The image is familiar to medieval Christianity in the guise of the tree of Jesse, a representation of the virgin and child. Another unusual Christian connection, if connection is the right word, is the existence of a text titled Hadith Madinat Waqwaq, which I haven't yet seen, but which the manuscript catalog in the Daiba collection at the University of Tokyo apparently describes how Jesus converted the people of Waqwaq to Christianity. And note to self, I must request this manuscript or go find it because I haven't seen it yet. In an old French poem on the legend of Alexander, young women are born with and wilt with the flowers of a tree. If they leave the shade of these trees, they die. This is reminiscent of the Japanese story in which the spirit of a willow tree marries a mortal, but when the tree is felled, must return to it and die with it. It is certainly very likely that the tree mentioned in the Arab, Chinese, and Japanese accounts have shared histories. The divergences child, adult, flower, fruit, laughter, cry of waqwaq, and manner of birth and death appear to be the product of transmission, translation, and what I've been calling fabular cross-pollination. Take Japan again. In the Edo period, 1603 to 1687, we find the Jinmenju or Ninmenju, the human face tree. And the tale is elaborated in other texts. There is even a contemporary Japanese musical group called Waqwaq Kingdom. And the Pokemon Executor. Oops. How did this happen? I went all the way ahead. Goodness. What has happened to the slideshow? Forgive me, I must have pressed a button that I wasn't supposed to press. Or maybe I lost the slide. There is even a Pokemon, for those of you who care about Pokemon, called Executor, which is actually a little waqwaq tree, or actually it's the Ninmenju tree. To go from the ridiculous, I say this non-judgmentally, to the sublime, there is a very early Arabic attestation of a tree, the fruits of which are corporeal, long before the encyclopedic 9th century Jahiz. Oh, I do mention Jahiz. None between the 9th century Jahiz describe waqwaq as a cross between a plant and an animal. The Quran mentions 4 times the zakum tree. Here's one reference from Surah Waqia. They basked once in luxury, unhinged in their transgression, and asked in mockery, when we are bones and dust, will we be brought back to life, our fathers and theirs too? Reply, yes, those from distant times and from the recent past as well. You who deny and go astray will all be gathered on an appointed day and devour the fruit of zakum until your stomachs are bloated and lap at scalding water like parched camels. Such hospitality on the day of doom. So it's a tree in hell with the heads of demons where fruit should be. This motif would have been known to all the authors writing about waqwaq. The possibility that this Quranic motif informed the many later accounts of the waqwaq tree cannot therefore be excluded. The art historian Eva Baer, who has catalogued examples of the waqwaq tree motif in medieval Islamic art, writes that the earliest description is on a slab from a palace of the Ghaznavid period, and that the decorative designs reflect the talking or waqwaq tree of the Alexander Romance. This talking tree is the transformed oracular tree of the sun and moon, which is reputed to have warned Alexander of his approaching death. Indeed, it is my belief that representations of the waqwaq tree in illustrated manuscripts of the Prophet's journey to heaven influenced the Alexander Romance visually and correspondingly narratively as well, right? So there's a discussion of and a representation of the entwined tree of the sun and moon. The zakum tree is illustrated in manuscripts, and then if you look at manuscripts that post-date the advent of the illustrations of the zakum tree, the tree of Alexander begins to resemble a zakum tree more and no longer the oracular sun and moon tree. Writing about the appearance of the waqwaq tree in the Turkish shadow play tradition, one scholar, this is the slide. So these are both Alexander approaching the tree. And you can see on the left, it's the sun and moon are prominent, there are 2 heads, but then there are animal heads. And on the right, you have all the animal heads. And it looks more and more like a waqwaq tree, but with a tree with heads where fruit should grow. And then as you see, there is one woman there in the upper right. Writing about the tree in the Turkish shadow play tradition, one scholar has suggested a possible scriptural source that is not the Quran, namely the final act in the story of Esther in the Hebrew Bible, the death of Haman. In it, the thorn tree volunteers to be the gallows, which in one representation looks like this. Actually, I have. So these are the caragos, and this is one representation of the tree. Is it? Yes, it is. An alternative suggestion is that it is inspired by the hanging from a particular tree of the Janissaries in 1826 in a reenactment of an earlier such execution that took place in 1655 or thereabouts. There is, it seems, no getting away from waqwaq. The latter incident became widely known as the Waqae Waqwaqiye, the Waqwaq incident, and is how the Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi describes this execution. The Waqwaq tree is also described and depicted in the first book about the New World, written east of Italy in the Holy Roman Empire, which appeared in 1580 in Istanbul. That work, by an unknown author, is the Ottoman Tarikh-i Garbi. It was printed by Ibrahim Mutafarrika in 1730 and remained till the 19th century the primary source of information on Americana for the Ottomans. Mappamundi were included in 1689 and maps updated, but the text remained unchanged. The first third of the Tarikh summarizes traditional Islamic cosmography, and the remaining two-thirds recounts the feats of explorers and conquistadores from 1492 to 1552, followed by accounts of the inhabitants of the New World. These are based on passages translated from the Italian editions of several European accounts, with 90% of the information from Francisco López de Gómara's 1552 La Historia General de las Indias. The inclusion of illustrations in works dealing with the New World was common, so it is not surprising that these are to be found in the Tarikh. Most are efforts on the part of the artist to depict what is described, but because the things illustrated are so unfamiliar, they appeared fabulous. In most instances, what is depicted is quite real: manatees, tapirs, anteaters, armadillos, sloths, geese, and birds of paradise, avocados, bananas, the silver mine town of Potosi. But also included are illustrations. So this is the hanging of the Janissaries. Are illustrations of the Waqwaq tree. And this is an illustration from a manuscript of the Tarikh and the Newberry Library. The mermen and harpies that are elsewhere in the text originate in López de Gómara's account of the West Indies. The Waqwaq tree, however, does not emanate from any 16th century European account, but from a geography and cosmography added to the beginning of the work that quotes from Mas'udi, Ibn al-Wardi, Qazwini, and Qurtubi, one of which mentions Waqwaq, and which the illustrator of this book dutifully represents. Discussion of the tree occurs in the prefatory discussion of climes, and nowhere in the Tarikh does it say that the tree is to be found in America, even though every other illustration is of something to be found in America. And by placing it first in the book, the other first is that this is very likely the first printed picture in the, quote, Islamic world, that is, naked women hanging from trees. The impression is given, the unmistakable impression, that it is a wonder of the New World. So strong is this impression that Howard L. Hurwitz, in his 1968 An Encyclopedic Dictionary of American History, which I now believe to be the uncited source of the Wilson Quarterly's editorial interpolation I mentioned at the beginning, actually devotes an entry, W, to Waqwaq tree, which reads as follows. Waqwaq tree. In an effort to attract settlers to America in the 18th century, promoters resorted to devices that would stun 20th century advertising men. In 1729, Ibrahim Effendi, a Turkish writer, lured immigrants to America with his account of the Waqwaq tree, a tree whose fruit was beautiful women. Hurwitz, who somehow had access to the Ottoman account, places Waqwaq in the New World, even as he gets almost everything else completely wrong. It's 1730. Ibrahim Effendi is actually Hungarian, and obviously there are no Waqwaq trees, at least none that I found in North America. Although there are many sources that mention or locate Waqwaq, this is from the 12th century Persian romance, the Darabname, and many stories connected with it, none helps to identify Waqwaq with certainty. If we can be certain that besides the name of a tree, it is the name of a coastal country or island, we do not have any incontrovertible information about where that place might be. Geographers and travelers locate and situate Waqwaq in myriad and confusing ways, in China, on the African coast, in Japan. Another group of stories mentions a primitive people with whom this Arab settlers trade. Stories of this kind give locations for Waqwaq in Southeast Asia. Such stories come mainly from the Ajaib al-Hind and others who copied this work. The ship in the first story comes across a Waqwaq on the way to Sumatra. In a similar tale found later in the work, Waqwaq is between Sribuza and China, and in yet another case beyond the end of Dibajatadom, that is the Maldives. The great 11th century scientist and polymath Biruni, for his part, says Waqwaq is in Cambodia. Given this kaleidoscope of choices, scholars of the last 200 years or so have identified Waqwaq with just about every island, peninsula, and archipelago in the Indian Ocean. Toorawa, who opted for Japan, was swayed by an early Chinese name for Japan, Wokuo or Waqwaq in Cantonese, of which Waqwaq is evidently an approximation. Gabriel Ferrand favored Madagascar because he likened the tree to the pandanus tree, The pandanus, when the leaves fall to the ground, emit a sound. He also identified a Malagasy name for the tree, Waqwaq. In fact, in Mauritius, that tree is still called a Waqwaq, which sounded to him like Waqwaq. Marina Tomacheva has subject claims of an East African Waqwaq to some serious scrutiny. And Claude Alibert has made the case for the Seychelles, based mainly in the idea that he connects it to this famous Seychelles coconut, which the shape of which he thinks accounts for some of the accounts. Dounicht proposed Irian Jaya, the Moluccas, and even Australia. Marhum Wolfhard Heinrichs, at a paper I gave in 1998 at the American Oriental Society in Miami, stood up and said, I recall a reference to Australia in Dounicht's work, and boy, was he right, because I found it. And this is something he was remembering from 25 years before. The Philippines can also lay claim. There are creatures in Philippine mythology described as beautiful and fair maidens who in the daytime drape their wings over the branches of trees deep in the jungle while they sleep, with their long hair covering their faces. They are called aswang in Tagalog, Bicol in other languages, but in the language of Surigao, they are called Waqwaq. In one account, the aswang or Waqwaq is depicted as tying a skirt around her while flying and beating her buttocks with a magical pandanus streamer. The pandanus, that is that tree. The pandanus being, yes, the tree I told you about. Of great interest is the further fact that the Filipina tree-dwelling Waqwaq cry out kakak in an uncannily similar sound to Nulwardi's sound of women shouting out khalak, for example. And that is also on the right, another card from the game Magic the Gathering. And I just thought I would include it here as a sort of flying creature. Where does this leave us? Waqwaq is different places at different times, is different things in different places, is a place that isn't one, is liminal, ambiguous. Reviewing the evolution of Waqwaq, the Arabist André Miquel adumbrates Waqwaq's presence as absence. Quote, from the absence of Waqwaq in the accounts of China and India to its insistent presence in the wonders of India, or the abridgment of the wonders of the world, from the flower with the Muslim creed inscribed on it to the to the fruit resembling humans and the human tree, the legend follows always an ascending path. Blooming already as the known areas of the distant East, it cannot but blossom and spread as the distant East is erased behind another East more distant than it, the ends of the earth. This is how the concept of the island circulates, as something distant, unattainable. The artist Hav Kahraman in a series called To the Land of Waqwaq, appropriates the depiction of sexualized women and the distant place that is Waqwaq, that for her as a child was indeed unattainable. Some of you may know Hav Kahraman, and some of you may know her from the cover of the Library of Arabic Literature volume Impostures, which is a modern interpretation of Al-Wasiti's depiction of the Maqamat of Al-Hariri. These are two from her piece that were displayed at the in a museum in LA where she had a residency. The setting for the Syrian comedy series, Al-Waqwaq, about societal failure and crisis of leadership, is a cast of shipwrecked passengers who are on their way to America, by the way. The setting is the deserted island of Waqwaq. You can watch these on YouTube. When the protagonist in Mahmoud Az-Zubairi's political novel Ma'sat al-Waqwaq, the Waqwaq tragedy, is asked where he is from, he replies, I am from Waqwaq. And when he is then told, how can that be? It doesn't exist. He replies, how can it not exist? I'm from there. And there is an Egyptian expression, Il-Hagadi mahtasalch wala fi bilad wa'il. These things don't happen, not even in Waqwaq. A convincing piece of evidence that Waqwaq is simply the name given to the conceptual limit of the known world is a statement made by Hassan al-Basra's eventual guide in the 1001 Nights, Sheikh Abdul Quddus, when he attempts, unsuccessfully as it happens, to discourage the distraught husband from trying to rescue his wife, who has recently absconded to Waqwaq. Sheikh Abdul Quddus says, my son, relinquish this most vexatious affair. You could not gain access to the islands of Waqwaq, even if the flying jinn and the wandering stars assisted you, since between you and those islands are 7 valleys, 7 seas, and 7 mountains, of vast magnitude. End quote. Sadly, I have not taken this advice. أشكركم وقواق الشكر يعني غاية الشكر. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shawkat. That was even more kaleidoscopic than I would have expected. Fantastic, thank you. Before I switch off the camera and not the camera, the recording, and we turn to the questions. You can think about the questions. I would like to re-advertise once more our next speaker, who is Vinay Khatia, on Wednesday on images of Fatima in the Sunni and Shia historiography and Hadith. And then next Monday, Parvane Purshaliati on sharing wives and drinking wine, Mazdakits Ayars Mitraists, accusations and realities. And next Wednesday, Hafsa Kanjwal, colonizing Kashmir, state building under Iranian occupation. And now I will switch off the recording and ask you to ask your question.